The massive 1945 Soviet invasion of Manchuria, commonly called Operation August, delivered the decisive blow that defeated Japan and ended World War II. The Soviet military labels the campaign the Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation, while Western historians usually refer to it as Operation August, despite the absence of an official Japanese name. Outside Japanese and Soviet scholarly circles, the offensive is little known. Yet it was the greatest military catastrophe in Japan's history, and, alongside the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was pivotal to the war's end. Even though many Western accounts understate its importance, over the course of a brutal month of fighting in a remote and still partly obscure region, more than 1 million Japanese soldiers and several 100,000 civilians were killed or taken prisoner. The origins of that disaster go back to 1931, when events set in motion the eventual destruction of 4 Japanese armies, each comparable in size to an American field army. Japan's militarists exploited the Chinese Civil War between Mao Zedong's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists as a chance to claim a place among the imperial powers and to seize territory in China, Manchuria, and Korea. The Imperial Japanese Army was eager above all to prove its strength. They first courted the Chinese warlord, then ruling Manchuriat, and as disorder in China deepened, the Japanese staged provocations that led to the invasion and occupation of Manchuria in the spring of 1931, an action that sparked the Sino-Japanese War and that continued until Japan's surrender in August 1945. During the 1930s and 1940s, most Japanese officials, despite China's vast size and population, regarded it as weak and ripe for colonization and exploitation. The army, and to a lesser degree the Imperial Navy along the coast, were the chief militarist factions pushing for more Chinese territory. Those transgressions, however, drew the Soviet Union into the equation. Premier Joseph Stalin, increasingly alarmed that Japanese ambitions were approaching his Far Eastern borders, began to view their moves with growing concern, and in late July 1938, Soviet and Japanese troops clashed for the first time. That encounter, known to the Japanese as the Chongqing Incident and to the Russians as the Battle of Lake Khasan, set the pattern for later confrontations. To deter further Japanese incursions, a powerful Soviet force of more than 20 infantry divisions concentrated on the Manuo frontier of Manchuria, Japan's puppet state. Tokyo largely ignored the danger while focused on the China incident, but Russian military strength hardened Japanese suspicions, reinforced by memories of Russia's defeat in 1905 and by Stalin's recent purges of Soviet officers. During the 1938 border dispute, a senior Soviet defector passed significant intelligence to the Kwantung Army, and a local Soviet commander occupied part of the contested line. The defection prompted a Japanese division to rush to the scene as the ever-aggressive Kwantung commanders prepared to expel the Soviet presence while diplomats exchanged warnings. The Soviets reinforced in turn. All Tokyo technically needed was the emperor's routine formal authorization to strike. But when that permission was withheld, Kwantung leaders were enraged and pressed their case more insistently. Ultimately, a local Japanese divisional commander, alleging that Soviet troops were building defenses on Japanese soil, attacked on his own initiative. This was not the Kwantung Army's first unauthorized action, nor its last, and its leaders even contemplated deposing the civilian government if it tried to restrain them. The skirmish at Chonufang was relatively small. Fewer than 2,000 Japanese troops launched a surprise night assault. But while the Japanese considered the incident closed, the Soviets did not. General Gregory Stern raised the Red Banner Far Eastern Army's 49th Corps, and a series of Soviet counterattacks forced the Japanese to retreat, inflicting heavy losses on both sides. Diplomacy eventually settled the dispute. But the scale and intensity of the Soviet response unnerved Japanese planners, altered Kwantung Army plans for a possible invasion of eastern Russia, and led Tokyo to order all other units to strengthen border defenses to deter further Soviet intervention. This course of action produced the confrontation commonly called the Nomonhan Incident. On May 11, 1939, routine clashes between border guards flared into open battle, and unlike the Chonfang skirmish, the Nomonhan fighting developed into a large-scale engagement. Stalin judged that Japanese provocations had crossed a line and ordered a strong reply, sending the young commander Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, who would later gain renown at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Berlin, to take command. The fighting that followed, which ran into August 1939, cost the Japanese between about 18,000 and 23,000 lives while producing almost no territorial gain. Diplomacy again halted the fighting but did not settle the deeper dispute. And to cool tensions, the Soviet Union and Japan signed a non-aggression pact in April 1941. Within a year of Nomonhan, Japanese planners debated how to finish the war in China. Some urged an invasion of the Soviet Union to eliminate the northern threat and free troops for China. Others argued for cutting off China's supplies until it surrendered, while critics warned that either course risked war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. By spring 1940, German forces had overrun much of Western Europe, and the British Expeditionary Force had evacuated from Dunkirk. Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact in September 1940, and those apparent European successes hardened the appetite among Japanese commanders for striking against Western interests. That impulse produced the 1941 attacks on Pearl Harbor, Wake, the Philippines, and other American, British, French, and Dutch possessions across the Pacific. From 1940 to 1945, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, also responsible for Korea, remained largely intact and saw no major clashes with Soviet forces. But the wider demands of the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific drained its best combat formations as divisions were sent to the Central Pacific, the Philippines, and New Guinea. As a result, the Kwantung Army was left with undertrained, understrength units that would be vulnerable if a new opponent appeared. Allied campaigns and high-level conferences produced precisely that opponent. British and American forces were engaged in the Pacific, Italy, North Africa, and Northwest Europe. And with Britain left with only token forces in the Far East, the Western Allies welcomed any additional help against Japan. Once Germany surrendered, planners had to prepare for final operations. The Anglo-American atomic project remained secret, and its success uncertain, and even if the bomb worked, an invasion of the home islands might still be needed to force capitulation. The Allies repeatedly sought Soviet intervention at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, and although Stalin agreed in principle, he delayed details. As the war progressed and Allied intelligence reported progress on the atomic weapon, Soviet interest in securing territory in the Far East increased, and Stalin consented to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat, a timetable that was accelerated after the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. By mid-1945, the Kwantung Army numbered roughly 780,000 officers and enlisted men organized into 24 infantry divisions, 2 tank divisions, and 5 aviation squadrons. And it was operating jointly with 7 additional infantry divisions, about 260,000 troops stationed in Korea. Headquartered at Shinkyo and commanded by General Otoichi Yamada, the Kwantung Army supervised numerous formations in the 1st, 3rd, and 5th Area Armies. Supplementary contingents included roughly 220,000 troops from Mengjiang and about 10,000 from Manchukuo, and some estimates placed Japan's available defensive manpower at about 100,000. Tens of thousands more civilians, men, women, and children, worked for or had settled in Manchuria under Japanese rule. Large Red Army formations were being prepared for operations in the Far East. Even as Soviet forces readied to fight for Berlin in April 1945, Stalin began in March to shift major formations eastward, moving whole fronts to reinforce the Pacific theater. A Soviet front, the counterpart of an army group, typically comprised 3 to 5 armies and could total on the order of 100,000 men. And among the units massed eastward were several army headquarters, the 6th Guards Tank Army and the 5th, 39th and 53rd Infantry Armies. The soldiers chosen for redeployment to the Far East were not simply gathered by chance, but were specifically selected because of their valuable combat backgrounds. Many of them had previously fought in mountainous areas such as the Carpathians, giving them practical knowledge of operating in rugged environments, much like those of the Greater Khingan Range and other elevated areas of Manchuria. Others were veterans of campaigns in marshlands and mud-choked terrain, making them well-suited for operations in Manchuria's swamps and waterlogged valleys. Alongside these troops came specialized reinforcements, including numerous tank regiments, artillery units, and engineer formations, all of which were deemed essential for the kind of complex operations that would be necessary. Beginning in March 1945 and continuing until August, this immense redeployment relied heavily on the Trans-Siberian Railway, which carried between 20 and 30 full trains of men and equipment eastward every single day. By the time the operation was complete, the number of Soviet divisions stationed in the region had doubled, rising from around 40 to nearly 80, each supported by powerful auxiliary formations such as armored and mechanized brigades. The Soviet presence in the Far East had, by August, become a force of enormous scale, capable of overwhelming any defense Japan might mount. Just as Nazi Germany had concealed its preparations prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army carefully kept these deployments hidden from Japanese border observers, concentrating forces in rear areas before quietly moving them forward to their strike positions under the cover of darkness. Manchuria itself was vast, covering nearly 5 million square kilometers of highly diverse terrain that included mountain chains, marshes, fertile valleys, and barren stretches of steppe. Its geography made it invaluable to any regional power, bordered as it was by Korea in the south, Siberia and the Soviet Far East in the east and north, and Outer Mongolia to the west. For China, Japan, and the Soviet Union alike, control of Manchuria meant not only a secure defensive buffer, but also the potential launchpad for offensive operations against neighbors. Yet despite this importance, the region suffered from a poor road network, with routes that deteriorated quickly in harsh weather, making railways and fortified areas the backbone of any serious military plan. Control of the Central Valley, where most of the local population lived and where the bulk of agricultural production was located, was especially critical for sustaining both defensive and offensive operations. High ground such as the Barga Plateau and the Greater Khingan Mountains held further importance since whoever commanded them could dominate the rest of the region militarily. The Japanese defenders of Manchuria were organized into large formations comparable in scale to Western Army groups, designated area armies. The 1st Area Army, responsible for eastern Manchuria, included the 3rd and 5th Armies, each with 3 infantry divisions, along with other attached formations under the leadership of men such as General K and Seichi. By August 1945, this force numbered more than 222,000 men. The other major component of the defense was the 3rd Area Army under General Ushiroku Janet, which oversaw a combination of units: the Independent Mixed Brigade, a tank brigade, and 4 infantry divisions of the 30th Army, as well as 3 infantry divisions, 1 tank brigade, and another independent mixed brigade of the 44th Army. Jun commanded additional mixed brigades and infantry, bringing the total to nearly 181,000 men. This army bore responsibility for central and western Manchuria, where control of the open plains was crucial. A further force, the 4th Independent Army under Lit Gen Waramiko, deployed in north-central and northwestern Manchuria, fielded 3 infantry divisions and 4 separate mixed brigades, amounting to over 95,000 men. In addition, the 125th Infantry Division remained in reserve, answering directly to higher headquarters for deployment where needed. General Otoichi Yamada commanded the 34th Army in northern Korea, controlling the 59th Division at Hungnam and the 137th Division at Chongpyong, while Tokyo dispatched another 50,000 troops after the Soviet declaration of war to bolster these forces. The 17th Army, with 2 separate mixed brigades and 7 more infantry divisions, was also assigned to southern Korea. Coastal defense was further reinforced by the Sungari River Naval Flotilla, a collection of small but useful vessels tasked with local patrol and support duties. In all, the Imperial Japanese Army's strength in Manchuria amounted to more than 713,000 soldiers, supported by over 1,100 tanks, 5,360 artillery pieces, and nearly 2,800 aircraft. On paper, this force, consisting of 31 infantry divisions, 9 separate mixed brigades, 2 tank brigades, and 1 specialized brigade, looked formidable. However, the reality was much weaker than the numbers suggested. Many divisions were under strength or filled with inexperienced young recruits, as the best trained and most experienced formations had been drained away over the years to reinforce the Philippines, New Guinea, and other critical Pacific theaters. Japanese armor was badly outdated and unable to compete with Soviet tanks, even with those considered obsolete by 1941 standards. Soviet artillery was both more advanced and more numerous, and their air forces outnumbered Japanese aircraft by at least 2 to 1. In sheer manpower, the Soviets could field forces equal or superior to the Japanese, but in tanks, artillery, and planes, they enjoyed overwhelming superiority. Japanese planning had shifted repeatedly as the war dragged on and the global situation changed. Until 1944, there had been some expectation of carrying out offensive operations against both China and the USSR, but those ideas gave way to defensive planning as the war situation worsened. By September 1944, Japanese strategy focused on establishing layered defenses inside Manchuria. Outlying garrisons were reorganized into new divisions numbered 121 through 128 and into additional mixed brigades to replace standard divisions that had been transferred elsewhere. To bolster the Kwantung Army further, Tokyo called up some 250,000 reservists, forming 8 new divisions numbered 134 through 139, as well as 148 and 149, along with several brigades and smaller supporting units. However, this reorganization substituted large numbers of inexperienced soldiers for seasoned ones, which ironically left the army weaker overall. The revised defensive plan called for most major formations to withdraw 40 to 70 kilometers behind the border into fortified strongpoints, each guarded by 1 or more divisions, leaving only small detachments to contest the immediate frontier. The main defensive stand was intended to be made around strongholds such as Tonghua, near the boundary with Korea, with roughly 2/3 of the forces inside fortifications and 1/3 attempting to delay the Soviet advance along the borders. Japanese intelligence officers and diplomatic couriers were aware of the mass troop movements occurring across the Trans-Siberian Railway, with thousands of Soviet soldiers and vast amounts of equipment shifting from west to east. The sudden recall of Soviet diplomats only heightened the suspicion that war was imminent. Still, many Japanese officials convinced themselves that the Soviets would delay any major offensive until late August, expecting them to bide their time rather than launch an immediate attack. This complacency persisted despite the Soviet government's clear statement in April 1945 that it would not renew the neutrality pact with Japan. In reality, the Red Army was completing preparations for one of the largest offensives of the war. Supreme command in the theater fell to Marshal Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky, a veteran officer who had risen through the ranks since joining the Red Army in 1918. Having attended the General Staff Academy and worked in the operations section of the Soviet General Staff, he became Chief of Staff in 1942 and later commanded the 3rd Belarusian Front during the East Prussian campaign. He had already played a critical role in the battles of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Great Belarusian Offensive before being appointed to lead Soviet operations in the Far East. His main operational formation was the Trans-Baikal Front, which fielded the 6th Guards Tank Army, the 17th, 36th, 39th, and 53rd Armies, along with a Mongolian cavalry mechanized group and the 12th Air Army. Altogether, these forces comprised about 30 rifle divisions, 5 cavalry divisions, 2 tank divisions, 10 tank brigades, and 8 mechanized brigades, an army of over 640,000 men, accounting for more than 40% of the Soviet strength in the theater. Marshal Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky, who had commanded fronts in major battles at Odessa, Budapest, and Vienna, also directed significant portions of the Soviet buildup, ensuring that the blow against Japan would be massive, coordinated, and decisive. Malinovsky's colleague in the east was Marshal Kirill Meretskov. Then about 48, whose first Far Eastern Front included the 9th Air Army, the 5th Guards Army, the 1st Red Banner Army, the 25th and 35th Armies, the 10th Mechanized Corps, and an operational grouping. Meretskov marshaled roughly 589 men, some 12 tank brigades, 2 mechanized brigades, a cavalry division and 31 rifle divisions, or about 37% of the Soviet forces committed to the theater. The Second Far Eastern Front, the smallest of the 3 main Soviet fronts, comprised the 5th Separate Rifle Corps, the Kuril Operational Group, the 15th, 16th and 2nd Red Banner Armies, and the 10th Air Army, totaling roughly 337,096 soldiers, about 21% of the Eastern Soviet buildup. The creation of these combined fronts reflected the Red Army's steady modernization and its experience. A wartime Soviet combined arms army typically contained 7 to 12 rifle divisions, 1 or 2 artillery brigades, a tank destroyer brigade, an anti-aircraft brigade, a mortar regiment, signal and engineer regiments, 2 or 3 tank brigades, and, in some cases, a tank or mechanized corps producing formations of roughly 80,000, 100,000 men equipped with, on the order of 100, 200 self-propelled guns, 900, 2,500 guns and mortars, and 320-460 tanks. Soviet doctrine called for achieving local superiority on a single axis, punching through with concentrated artillery, armor, and air support, then exploiting the rupture with mobile tank and mechanized groups while partisans, airborne troops and reconnaissance units severed enemy supply and communications to collapse rear areas. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky planned a Manchurian campaign on 3 converging axes intended to envelop and destroy the Kwantung Army and seize control of the entire Manchurian region as quickly as possible. His initial sequence would have used Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's forces first, with Meretskov's following 1 or 2 days later. But after the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, he revised the timetable. On August 7th, he ordered a simultaneous multi-front offensive employing all 3 fronts, a decision reinforced after the second bomb struck Nagasaki on August 9th. The operational aim was to drive Japanese forces out of Manchuria and to link up in the south-central cities and rail hubs, Mukden, Harbin, and Kirin, while a supporting strike would press into northern Manchuria. Secondary operations against the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin were to be postponed depending on the progress of the main advances. Under the plan, the Trans-Baikal Front was to deliver the principal thrust, driving some 350 kilometers into the Japanese-held interior within 10 to 15 days and pushing toward Changchun while bypassing the heaviest Harbin defenses. The 6th Guards Tank Army was to spearhead the drive, accompanied by the 17th and 39th Armies, with the objective of seizing passes over the Greater Khingan Range, crossing into Inner Mongolia and taking key objectives in the Manchurian Plain within the first 5 days. Mongolian cavalry mechanized groups were assigned subsidiary desert thrusts to seize channels of approach and disrupt Japanese maneuver. Other formations, the First Far Eastern Front, for example, were to break or circumvent the frontier fortifications and operate in the enemy rear, while elements of the Trans-Baikal and Far Eastern fronts would converge to encircle major Japanese groupings and secure vital ports, such as Port Arthur. In parallel, the Second Front would strike across the Amur and related rivers to prevent Japanese units from slipping back to reinforce each other. The offensive emphasized speed, surprise, and combined arms action. Tanks would lead with artillery, infantry and aircraft in close support, so that no single Japanese position could be reinforced from neighboring sectors. After a rapid declaration of war, the Red Army crossed the Manchurian frontier 2 minutes after midnight on 9 August 1945, with advanced detachments followed by main formations. Because many Japanese units were in the process of withdrawing into prepared fortifications, most Soviet thrusts initially met little resistance, though some axes, such as those taken by the 36th Army, ran into stubborn border fortifications. Mechanized columns, led by brigades such as the 25th Mechanized and the 43rd Separate Tank Brigade, pushed on the Trans-Baikal Front's right flank, racing into the Inner Mongolian Desert and covering a strikingly rapid distance, about a 50-odd mile advance. On the opening day, while the 17th Army's tank battalions drove unaided some 70 kilometers to the east. The Transbaikal vanguard moved in multiple columns with small forward detachments, typically an artillery battalion, a tank regiment, and a rifle regiment, probing and breaching defenses. By nightfall, the lead elements had reached the foothills of the Greater Khingan. The 39th Army swung south to engage the Japanese 107th Division on the flank of the Transbaikal advance, bypassing some fortified zones and linking with rifle corps pressing at the Halor fortified region. Manchurian cavalry formations helped blunt isolated Japanese counterattacks. In many places, difficult terrain, rivers, bogs, and deserts slowed mechanized units more than enemy fire. So commanders improvised fresh forward detachments built around self-propelled gun battalions to keep momentum. These mixed detachments with tanks and infantry in close support could move farther and faster than previous formations and repeatedly shattered or overran Japanese defensive positions. The Japanese 124th Division, for example, was overwhelmed by a Fifth Army assault that advanced with some 12 divisions and nearly 700 armored vehicles, punching through positions Tokyo had judged secure. Elsewhere, the 36th Army used amphibious vehicles to ferry 2 rifle regiments of a corps across the swollen Argun River on the Transbaikal left flank, striking at the Halor fortified region, where Lieutenant General Mikio's 4th Separate Army, bolstered by the 119th Division and the 80th Independent Mixed Brigade plus local cavalry units, had been deployed. In poor weather and darkness, the Soviet 205th Tank Brigade seized bridges north of the town and launched a night attack. By 10th of August, with the 94th Rifle Division's help, Soviet forces had encircled the approaches, though the 80th Independent Mixed Brigade still tenaciously held the city center. Heavy fighting persisted at several points up to the formal Japanese surrender, even where Tokyo had expected major combat to wait until the autumn. The surprise and speed of the Soviet onslaught quickly disorganized Japanese command and control. Some formations began hasty withdrawals. The 3rd Area Army's commander chose to pull back to try to defend Mukden and protect families, a move that ran counter to other commanders' plans and further fragmented Japan's defense. Logistical problems also hampered the Red Army. Tracked vehicles damaged or short of fuel had to be replaced at the front, and wheeled units sometimes struggled in rough country. Yet Soviet forces adapted, using available highways and mountain passes to push mechanized corps through the Greater Khingan Range in torrential rain and darkness. By 10 to 12 August, many Japanese units were retreating or being encircled. The 107th Division's first organized resistance occurred on 12th of August near Waku and was shattered, leaving heavy losses in men and material. On the same day, an opposing Japanese district commander surrendered with roughly 1,000 troops to a Soviet rifle division. The campaign for towns such as Halor continued fiercely, as the Red Army rotated tanks out and poured in infantry to clear remaining strongpoints. Pockets of Japanese fighters delayed Soviet access by holding commanding ground, and elements such as the Japanese 119th Division blocked several approaches to the Greater Khingan passes. Meanwhile, Soviet cavalry mechanized corps, pushing through the Mongolian deserts, ran into spirited opposition from Manchurian and Mongolian horsemen, producing a chaotic, localized, mobile fight that resembled a miniature civil war. After 4 days of fighting, the Soviets finally pushed forward and seized Topenshin, but progress was hampered just as much by fuel shortages as by enemy action. The spearhead, the 6th Guards Tank Army of the Transbaikal Front, was forced to pause for 2 days on about 12-13 August because its supply lines could not keep up with the lightning advance over the region's poor roads. Heavier vehicles such as Lend-Lease Shermans, which burned far more fuel than Soviet models, had to be left behind to conserve petrol, and airlift missions by units like the 453rd Aviation Regiment were pressed into service to fly fuel to forward echelons. Japanese suicide raids on supply convoys contributed to the bottleneck, but fighting continued relentlessly. The 2nd Rifle Corps kept assaulting Halor against the Japanese 119th Division, while the 275th Rifle Division spent 13-14 August reducing a strong Japanese position at Wawa Railroad Station. Amid these battlefield events, Tokyo sought clarification of the Allied surrender terms, and on 14th of August, the Emperor ordered a cessation of hostilities pending instructions. The order produced confusion and backlash. Some commanders, notably General Yamada, initially ignored the imperial directive, inflaming internal divisions between officers bound by a code of absolute loyalty and others prepared to obey the sovereign's will. That split weakened Kwantung Army resistance until Yamada accepted a formal ceasefire on 19th of August. Vasilevsky, however, did not trust that a pause meant an orderly capitulation and pushed on to seize as much ground as possible before any surrender took full effect, aiming to capture key Manchurian cities. On 15th of August, the Soviet Manchurian Cavalry Mechanized Corps met stiff resistance from several Inner Mongolian cavalry divisions near Carabao. After 2 days of hard fighting, the Mongolian units were defeated and some 1,635 prisoners were taken. When Soviet forces entered Harbin, they uncovered one of the war's most notorious atrocities. Unit 731, run by Shiro Ishii, where human beings, principally Chinese civilians and POWs, and in some cases Allied captives, had been subjected to lethal biological and medical experiments under the guise of a research facility. Victims were exposed to diseases such as cholera, typhus, and plague, and were often murdered afterward. Bodies were disposed of in crematoria. Many personnel captured at Harbin were later prosecuted as war criminals, but some scientists who fled to Japan and were subsequently detained by American authorities escaped prosecution. As the Red Army's penetration deepened, the Japanese collapse accelerated. The Soviet advance symbolically crossed the Great Wall and linked up with Chinese communist units as it moved toward Peking, and towns fell in rapid succession. Halar surrendered with 3,227 prisoners. Mukden, Shenyang, was occupied on 24th of August. By 30th of August, the last major organized Japanese formation, the 107th Division, capitulated to the 94th Rifle Corps, which rounded up another 7,158 captives. Soviet tallies put Japanese dead at roughly 84,000 and prisoners at some 594,000, figures that have been disputed and revised repeatedly. Japanese records reported far lower totals of casualties and wounded. Both sets of numbers and the precise breakdown of losses remain contested. The official totals also omitted many categories of victims: deaths among Manchurian and Mongolian auxiliaries, the thousands of Japanese reservists and civilians killed in the campaign, and the uncounted missing. Some contemporary and later estimates assert that millions of Japanese, soldiers and civilians, were taken into Soviet custody after the offensive, with hundreds of thousands dying in captivity or disappearing during the subsequent months and winter, though exact counts vary sharply between sources. One account claims that of about 220,000 Japanese civilian settlers in Manchuria, roughly 80,000 died from starvation, suicide, or violence, and only about 140,000 eventually returned to Japan. Reports also document widespread sexual violence by some Red Army units as they occupied territory. Tens of thousands of Japanese and Chinese women were assaulted, sometimes repeatedly, and witnesses later recalled scenes of terror at airfields and displacement centers that drove some victims to suicide. The Manchurian offensive, Operation August Storm, destroyed the last major Japanese field force outside the home islands, shattered the hopes of die-hard militarists who wanted to keep fighting, and helped bring Japan's long imperial war to its